Well, hello, my name is Troy Lanigan. I'm president of the Canada Strong and Free Network. I want to welcome you all to April's exchange call. First and foremost, these calls do not happen without sponsorship. So a very special thank you to our sponsor, Modern Miracle Network. I also want to recognize and thank our partner organization, the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada. Thank you to our outstanding panelists, who we will get to shortly. I do regret to advise that Congressman Ralph Norman contacted us late yesterday to advise that some business has come up, which prevents him from joining us. A couple of quick housekeeping matters. First of all, we are going to let the chat function run today. I see it's filling up already, with the usual reminder that we will remove anyone who posts rude or objectionable contacts. The chat is for commentary and networking, and I also encourage the speakers as well, if you've got any links or information you want to share, just drop it in there. If you find it distracting, you can turn it off. The Q&A box is for questions, not the chat box. So we had 2,800 or so people register for this event. And while that's not our largest exchange call, it certainly is the most questions we've ever had in an exchange call. We had some 300 come in advance. So without a doubt, our moderator has no shortage of questions. Nonetheless, we will keep an eye on the Q&A box and do our best to get some in, but just to advise you of that in advance. Second, if you have suggestions on future topics, please connect through our website or email me directly at troy@canadastrongandfree.network. Our call next month, May 18th, will be on the topic Beyond the Carbon Tax. Finally, this Zoom call will be recorded and posted on our website probably about 2 hours after it is finished. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator today, Anthony Furey, for the next hour, maybe an hour and 10. We'll probably go a little bit over time today. Anthony's a columnist for Sun newspapers and also a contributor to our friends at True North News. We had a call on Monday, and I was giving Anthony the gears about how restrictive the Conservative government in Ontario was compared to the NDP regime I live under in British Columbia. And the very next day, our Solicitor General announced that orders would be drafted to stop people from leaving their health authority and that random audits of travelers would be conducted. So the lesson is never be smug with an Ontarian. So, thank you so much for doing this, Anthony, and over to you to lead our panel for the next hour. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Troy, and welcome everyone. And thanks so much for giving me this opportunity to speak with 4 guests who really have so much to say. So I'm going to get right into it. I think we're really privileged to have an embarrassment of riches today with our speakers, and each of them alone could probably give us an illuminating 1-hour lecture on the state of things right now as it stands. But I'm going to ask them to distill all of that wisdom that they have right now into about a 3-minute opening statement, asking if they can focus on next steps and where do we go from here, because I think there's a lot of appetite, frustration, questions about that. Where do we go from here? Certainly as it applies to the expertise of all of our speakers. And then I think we'll break the conversation into a group conversation, hearing everybody sort of chat, compare notes with each other, and then we'll weave in as many of your questions and concerns into the mix as we can. And I think our starting position right now in this conversation is probably that things are not working as well as they could be, dare I suggest, that there is great damage being caused by the current approach of favoring widespread blunt lockdowns over a more nuanced and evolved response, that there's a lot of important information getting lost in the mix right now for the general public and perhaps even for policymakers, and that there is a lot of politics going on right now in our decisions in ways that are perhaps hindering a more effective response. So let's get into it right away with our guests. Speaking of the politics getting into the mix, I'd like to start by asking Pierre Poilievre to give his opening statement. First, I'm not going to read everybody's extended bios because there's a lot of information online. So I'll leave that for the rest of you to look that up, although most of the people speaking, I'm sure you're familiar with them. Pierre is, of course, Conservative MP for Carleton and a lead critic on the opposition benches there. Hey, Pierre, great to have you with us. What are your thoughts on where do we go next?
Sorry, Anthony, I'm not sure that Pierre's on right now. I'm trying to connect him.
Okay, sounds good. Well, we will go to, let's head over to David Redman right now. Dave, a retired lieutenant colonel with 27 years of experience in the Canadian Forces and the former head of Alberta's Emergency Management Agency. David, I think a lot of people have watched those 1 hour presentations you've given, really from A to Z on what's going on here. But how would you give us sort of the elevator pitch right now on what's the most acute issue right now? How do we move forward?
Thanks, Anthony. I am going to go back just a little bit and then come to the present. So if you don't mind, to try and be concise, I've written what I'm going to say as my opening statement, and I'll just read it. So fear is the key word. Emergency management is the key concept. Pandemics happen continuously and are a public emergency, not a public health emergency. In an emergency, confidence in government is essential, and fear should never be used as a methodology for response. We had written emergency management-based pandemic plans in every province and territory in Canada. These plans were based on hard lessons learned from previous pandemics. The use of the 15 non-pharmaceutical interventions, which we now call lockdowns, were part of those plans. But most NPIs were not key methodologies in our pre-written plans for two reasons. First, they were known to be effective in stopping the spread of the disease, but only in the first several weeks. And second, they were known to have severe collateral damage. The first step in an emergency is to do a hazard assessment. COVID was clearly the hazard. We knew that COVID is a coronavirus, which was most dangerous to people over the age of 75 and those over 60 with severe comorbidities. As a coronavirus, it could evolve and mutate continuously. So what really happened in Canada? 96% of all deaths in Canada are people over the age of 60 with multiple comorbidities. In fact, the average age of death in Canada is 84, with an average of 2.8 severe comorbidities. Lockdowns did not save a single one of those seniors, but quarantine of our long-term care homes could have. Ignoring emergency management principles, folks, is deadly. Conversely, for people under 60, COVID, while a risk, needs to be put into perspective without fear. Let me give you some of that perspective. Canadians right now, between the age of 20 and 40 years old, are 5 times more likely to be a vehicle fatality in Canada than to die of COVID. In fact, all Canadians under 60 are 50% more likely to be a vehicle fatality. Yet our government has not banned cars to save our lives. Worldwide, 1.9 million people died of COVID in the first year. 2.54 million people die from pneumonia every year. If these statistics were discussed daily by our premiers and MOH, they would give people confidence to go to work, send their children to school, and get on with their lives. So what has the use of lockdowns achieved? At best, they've had a small but not significant effect on the transmission of COVID. They did not protect our seniors in long-term care homes or in the public at large. Based on comprehensive peer-reviewed studies, they have done at least 10 times more harm than good, shown by the massive collateral damage to our mental health, our societal health, the education and development of our children, to citizens who have other severe illnesses and diseases who are too afraid to seek diagnosis and treatment, and to our economy that will take decades to recover. I point out, to the detriment of the health and wellness of our citizens. So how do we get out of this tragic response to COVID? Number one, treat this as a public emergency, not a public health emergency. Number two, go back to basic emergency management principles. Number three, remove the campaign of fear. Remove lockdowns, explain why, give context to COVID like I just did, and remove the threat of ever using lockdowns again for COVID. Fourth, develop and publicly issue clear and achievable written plans for recovery of our country, including how to overcome the devastating collateral effects of lockdowns. One final thought, because this is a business community. If one of your department heads had 15 months to develop solution to challenges running their department due to extremely high workload and failed, you would fire them. So why do we believe the MOH should be able to continually stop other people going to work to save our medical system after 15 months on the job of COVID? If you want anything more, please go to the resource page that was given for this webinar, or go directly to pandemicalternative.org, where you will find masses of peer-reviewed science. And I'll be happy to answer any of your questions at the end. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that, Dave. And I know a lot of the conversation, shifts on where this is most acutely being felt in long-term care initially, now in ICUs, in hospital systems. And Dr. Matt Strauss has a lot to say about, what's really going on in the medical community, how what he thinks about it from that vantage point. So, Matt, if I can ask you to speak now in your capacity as a critical care physician based out of Ontario.
Sorry, I was muted. Hi, I'm Matt Strauss. Thanks for having me. I'm coming to you live from my work on a COVID ward. So COVID is very real. I've been treating it for the past year. I've seen lots of people sick with it. I've seen some folks tragically die of it. I think that's the first thing I would say to couch my comments is there's a lot of folks with a lot of good ideas on moving forward, but we do have to be clear-eyed that this disease is harmful to some. In terms of just giving 3 minutes on it, I boiled what I have to say down to 3 words: risk, meaning, and consent. And I think focusing on these words are how we move forward in a more rational and less harmful way, personally and on a societal level. So Mr. Redman put some things into excellent context. I have a few other contextual details. So at the beginning of this pandemic, the early data from communist China suggested that there's a 5% death rate with COVID. We now know, multiple peer-reviewed papers, it's something more like 0.3% per case of COVID. And to put that into context, the other thing to know is it's 1,000 to 10,000 times more likely to kill someone who is extremely old than someone who is extremely young. So if you are under 35 and you get COVID-19 in Canada today, you are more likely to die in a car accident in the next 12 months than of your COVID-19. If you are under 50 and you get COVID-19, you are more likely to die of any accident. So, falling from a ladder, falling from a roof, plus car accidents, all of these things. So as we move forward with this disease, as we have with past diseases, we have to take personal risk into consideration. If you are over 80 and have multiple comorbidities and live in a nursing home, your risk might be something like 20%, and we have to take that very, very seriously. So contextualizing risks, and then also contextualizing the risks of the measures that are proposed. As David mentioned, we are now 15 months into this. There is no high quality peer-reviewed scientific literature to show that lockdowns have saved lives. I've been waiting for it. I haven't seen it. But we know that some of the measures that we've imposed on people do have risks to their mental health and, in fact, their physical health. So as a physician, I have personally admitted multiple elders to hospital who were dying of starvation because their social supports that they were counting on to feed them were banned from their retirement home, this sort of thing. So A, personalized risk. B is meaning. I spend a lot of time with folks who are dying. I contemplate myself and I contemplate with them, what is the purpose of your life? What do you want to get out of the time that you have left? And the government can't tell you what the meaning of your life is. It's certainly not that the meaning of your life is to stay alive. When you're canceling weddings, when you're canceling people's funerals because of some risk that is not well expressed to you, it ought to be up to you to say whether you take that risk on or not. So my wedding was a year ago. Right before the lockdown, I was concerned for my grandfather, and I said, I don't think you should come. I would understand if you didn't. And he absolutely laughed at me and said he wouldn't miss it for the world. And that's his choice to make. That's not the government's choice to make. Which brings me to my last word, consent. So I'm a medical physician. If I don't explain to folks the risks of the treatments that I'm offering to them, and if I don't give them time to process that through their own meaning metrics to decide if that's a meaningful risk to them, if the benefit is meaningful to them, and I don't get their consent, then I'm violating their human rights by imposing it on them. So the thing I would ask you to do in moving forward is to keep using the words of consent and human rights. When children are not allowed on playgrounds, when folks are not allowed to visit their dying relatives in hospital, these are unquestionably violations of human rights and violations of individual consent. And I don't think there's a counter argument to that. I really don't. So I encourage you to use that boldly in your public speech going forward, when you're speaking to your MPs, when you're speaking to your neighbors. Say, I don't consent to this. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dr. Strauss. And speaking of speaking to our MPs, well, we have one of them here, not in government, on the opposition benches. Pierre Poilievre, well known, I'm sure, by pretty much all of you, MP for Carleton, and a lead opposition critic with the Conservative Party. Pierre, can you give us your few minutes take on, where do we go from here? What is the main challenge we face, and what are our next steps?
The next step is a plan to permanently reopen our economy. It's being done all around the world. As I told the House of Commons a few weeks ago, on April 1st, April Fool's Day, in Seattle, the Mariners invited 7,000 fans to come watch live. The same day, we have press release from the Toronto Blue Jays indicating that they're going to keep playing baseball in Florida, not in Toronto. So that is just one example, and not a frivolous one, by the way, of how we're being left behind as the rest of the world reopens safely and restarts its lives. And it's not just sporting events. Australians and New Zealanders are now traveling back and forth quarantine-free. Of course, there's the examples of Taiwan, where they've had a grand total of 7 deaths, not 7 per 100,000 or 7 per million, but 7 total. And they have a completely open economy. People are taking some modest precautions, but they are going to work. They are going to restaurants. They are socializing. They are visiting with their family members. The rest of the world is experiencing these openings. I just saw Boris Johnson enjoying a beer in a London pub last week as he went out and about and physically embraced constituents of the United Kingdom. And yet here in Canada, we're talking about some of the most severe restrictions anywhere on planet Earth. And then furthermore, what we have from the government is edicts that come down. Anyone who questions those edicts is dismissed as a conspiracy theorist or a disseminator of misinformation. Well, let's start with the fact that our own government disseminated significant misinformation from the very beginning when Trudeau told the House, and so did his health minister, that COVID was absolutely no threat to Canada. And then when we told him to close the borders, he left them open for 3 months after he'd been briefed his cabinet had been briefed by the military of the brewing pandemic in China. And then they said, masks don't work, don't use masks. Now they say we must wear masks. So we should all be afraid at any time when the government tells you that it is going to stop the spread of information it does not like. We should be especially afraid when that same government has been misinforming its public systematically about the matter at hand for over a year. And what we are seeing also is that the real agenda behind politicians like Trudeau is exactly what we originally feared. I pointed out that Trudeau had signed on to something that he calls, and I quote, the Great Reset. This is an agenda that is supported by the Davos elite to use COVID in order to permanently expand the size and scope of government, and in the process limit the freedom of the people. Now, of course, the media erupted in outrage that I had suggested this, but now everything I predicted is bearing out. The finance minister, with very little media notice apart from yourself, Anthony, because you do actually report the facts, but the liberal media on Parliament Hill didn't even report the fact that she came out and called the pandemic a political opportunity. Imagine calling an event that has cost so many lives and livelihoods a political opportunity. Could you imagine the media outrage if, say, George W. Bush had announced in October of 2001 that 9/11 was to him a political opportunity? Well, that was the equivalent of what Chrystia Freeland did. And the political opportunity and the so-called epiphany she believed that it created was an opportunity for government to take over childcare, to take over pharmacare, to take over our medicine, the rearing of our kids, and large parts of our economy. And so for this government and unfortunately some others like it, they view COVID as a chance to massively expand the power and coercion of the state by limiting the freedom of the people. And we must be prepared to say that using evidence and always speaking factually, never alleging anything that isn't true, and frankly rejecting things that do spread on the internet that are not true. But at the same time, when there are facts laid before our eyes that point to a government power grab, we should be able to say so. That the evidence of that is long-standing. It goes right back to March of 2020, when Trudeau used COVID to attempt to empower himself to raise any tax to any amount for any reason between now and the end of 2022. That was the first power grab, but it was just the first of many, and there have been many more since. We should speak out firmly and aggressively against those power grabs. And finally, the Prime Minister, the Government of Canada should publish a plan for the provinces. Obviously, we don't control all the jurisdictional decisions of provincial governments, but for the provinces to follow, which would lead to a safe reopening of the country as vaccines finally make their way into Canadians' arms. And that reopening should be complete and permanent as soon as it is safely possible to do so. So that's what I think we should do from here, Anthony.
Great, thanks, Pierre. Let's go to our last sort of opening remarks right now. Professor Richard Audas is joining us right now, currently based in New Zealand, but lots of experience at institutes really around the world. And Professor, you were one of the authors of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute COVID Misery Index, which found that Canada actually not doing so great when you put a bunch of metrics in, including actually doing worse than the United States, which might go against the grain with some thinking out there. Give us your thoughts on where we're at right now and the direction we need to head in.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. Well, we did some work. Actually, it was kind of emerged, kind of looking at what was happening with COVID all over the world, and kind of actually, so being here in New Zealand and kind of following things around the world, we thought it would be kind of an interesting idea to actually look and see kind of how COVID has impacted everybody around the world, or certainly developed countries around the world. And the main idea is, then I put the link to our work in the chat box, but is that COVID-19 really has heaped misery on us all, and certainly looking at some of the comments flowing through, it's pretty evident that that's the case. We've all been impacted by this in some ways or others, and although for some and for some countries there's certainly been more misery than others, and here in New Zealand we've actually, you're quite right, we've fared very well out of this. Life has been very normal, as we've heard. We've now opened up a bubble with Australia. We can go to, I was in a bar last night, in fact, with an ice hockey team, believe it or not, here in New Zealand. So there's lots of things going on here that are, that makes life very normal, and so it's been very different. So what we wanted to do was take a holistic, data-driven approach to measuring where the misery has been the greatest, and we really kind of thought, as we thought about it and kind of looked at the data that was available, that really we thought there was really sort of three sort of categories of areas where people's lives have been made a bit more miserable, or quite a bit more miserable. Obviously, the disease itself, and looking at the health impacts that that we've certainly heard about today and have been following, and those are the kinds of the headline statistics that we look at each day. How many new cases, how many new deaths that are going on or that are occurring each and every day. Then we thought, well, actually, it'd be also interesting to see the responses to COVID-19. So where have governments taken action, and how effective has that been at reducing and relieving some of that misery? So this is, looking at things like the testing that has gone on, and certainly, testing is one of the primary tools that we can use to control the disease. And one of the things that certainly we've seen in places where the disease has become well managed is that testing is the backdrop to keeping things open. So again, here in New Zealand, we have a very aggressive surge force of disease. So if there is a case that does break out very quickly, we do lots of tests in that geographic area, which essentially means that we can have a much more concentrated lockdown in the areas where the disease is fearing, or we fear the disease might break out. And meanwhile, the rest of us, with the risks being extraordinarily small, can remain in sort of active and doing sort of things as we've normally done. One of the other, of course, things that we've been really interested here is in vaccination rates, which of course seemed pretty clear from the outset was going to be the pathway out of this. was actually getting as many people vaccinated as possible. And certainly, you know, our results that suggested that the US is doing better than Canada, which again kind of flies against the face of conventional wisdom, is really built on the backs of two things. Number one, a world leading vaccination rate, and very quickly from the outset, you know, the U.S. government sort of led a charge to put you know, a lot of resources, Operation Warp Speed, into getting a vaccine developed, and certainly now they're reaping the benefits of this, and as their societies are opening up, and one of the other measures that we look at for some of the misery is what we call a stringency index, which is basically measures the, you know, the public health restrictions that are placed on us. And while the U.S. things are gradually opening up and opening up with a reasonable degree of safety, here in Canada, or in Canada, I should say, you know, things are getting worse. And as we've seen in Ontario, BC, Quebec, you know, our lives are becoming more restricted. And again, that's, you know, this certainly does heap misery on us all. The last thing, and not to be understated, is the economic impact, and certainly, you know, the immediate result, the immediate impact was a shutting down of the economy. We saw massive declines in GDP. Certainly, you know, again, one of the things that looks like it's happening more quickly, and I think largely due to vaccinations, is the projections for the American economies to grow much more rapidly than we're going to grow in Canada over the next year or two, and certainly, you know, the amount of public debt that we've taken on to combat this virus is massive. You know, kind of at a, you know, not really since World War II have we seen kind of spending at this level, and it's you know, it's quite frightening to think that this is a, you know, a debt that we're going to you know, kick down the road to our, you know, to our children and potentially to our grandchildren. So again, we compared our Canada with 14 other developed nations, including the U.S. Canada ranked 9th out of 15. The U.S. Canada was 11th. The U.S. was 9th, and again, largely due to differences in vaccines and the more extreme economic impact. One of the things that we're really concerned about, and I think is kind of consistent with what we're hearing, is around the number of excess deaths. So one of the statistics that we look at is how many people more than normal die in a given week, and we sort of chart these statistics week over week. And one of the things that we've seen in Canada is these rates are very high. So suggesting that, you know, that lockdowns and preparations for COVID ravaging the healthcare system, and as a result, kind of discouraging people from seeking sort of routine healthcare, has now sort of, you know, is playing out in terms of, you know, large number of deaths for other causes. And again, this is, you know, something that I'm quite frightened by. I'm quite frightened by the fact that people aren't seeking routine care. They've been discouraged from you know, from seeking medical attention for maybe what might seem like relatively minor things, and perhaps for a few weeks that might have been okay. Now, as we stretch into, you know, into our second year and getting well into the second year of doing this, these routine things are going to become more severe. And my concern is that, you know, even when we look back, and, you know, and COVID is part of is in our history, or largely in our history, we'll still be sort of dealing with, you know, with the fallout of having not had people seek medical care and attention. Again, one of the things that we do a weekly update of the results, and again, does suggest some improvement for Canada in terms of vaccines, but certainly new variants are now causing caseloads to increase, and now for the first time really since the outset, where caseloads are growing faster in Canada than they are in the U.S. So in terms of the way forward, I mean, I do think that you know, certainly I'm a significant believer in vaccinations, and certainly the data there does support that you know, that vaccinations do work. So everyone should get one when they get an opportunity to do so. And also we should be you know, when we do go into lockdowns, be much more targeted and nuanced. I think those are the two words that I've heard today, and two words that I would largely agree with, that I think that we do need to protect the most vulnerable, but we do need to be careful in how we do that, because there certainly are other impacts that do fall out from COVID-19 beyond COVID-19 itself.
Right, great. Thank you, Professor. And it only just now occurred to me that while it's about noon for us, whether we're in Alberta or in Ontario, it's a bit of a different time of the day for you in New Zealand. So thanks very much for joining us.
No problem. Happy to do so.
It's rather inhospitable time for sure.
That's all right.
I wanted to jump right into a question here. Many questions from folks pre-written in about the issue of vaccines. And I think this is both your remarks, Professor, and I think, you know, Dr. Strauss, Pierre will have a lot to say about government implementation of that. Viewer Carrie writes in, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, and I have my vaccinations and I get the yearly flu shot. I do not trust the safety of this vaccine for many reasons, nor do I want this vaccine. The government has failed and lies in so many areas regarding COVID. Why should I trust them with the vaccine? And there's dozens of questions, similar concerns about the vaccine, particular questions about this, that, and the other efficacy or differences between mRNA and traditional vaccines and so forth. And Dr. Strauss, I know there's so much terrain to cover, but can I just get your initial response to that question there and your sort of perspective as someone on the front lines, speaking with regular Canadians as well as those who are unfortunately in the ICU with COVID?
Right. So I'm going to return to what I said about risk, meaning, and consent. I've had one shot of the Pfizer vaccine. It is, yes, it is. This is faster than vaccine development usually goes. I am open to the idea that it could be riskier than the published data suggests. But in terms of the published data, we're looking at a kind of 1 in 100,000 chance of having something significantly bad happen. And I think you have to take your personal risk of getting COVID into account when you make a decision about whether to get the vaccine or not. So my personal risk of dying of COVID is maybe on the 1 in 5,000 range. So 1 in 5,000 is more than 1 in 100,000. So I decided to take it. But I support folks who have a lot of questions, getting those questions answered, and I am very much against vaccine passports and infringing on their consent. I don't think you should take it until you agree to take it, let's say. And I think your concern should be taken seriously by your healthcare provider. But I do recommend it to folks who are at high risk of having a bad time with COVID. I also recommend it to folks who are concerned about giving it to someone that they live with. I'll say that in my personal experience, I have not had one person present to hospital with COVID-19 who was vaccinated more than 2 weeks, 2 weeks pre. So a couple folks kind of did arrive before the protection would have set in. And I'm looking after 20 folks right now in hospital with COVID-19. And I was looking after 10 different folks with COVID-19 in the ICU last week. So the witness of my eyes is that it seems to work. But we have to recognize the issue of consent.
Pierre, the Prime Minister didn't have too many jobs when it came to managing the pandemic. I mean, most of that is tasked with the premiers, but it seems like on the border issue and now with the vaccine delivery, for those who want it, they weren't getting it in the timeline and I guess the volume that they initially wanted it for. So what's your perspective right now on vaccines from that angle?
Well, you're right. He's really had 3 jobs throughout the pandemic. One is close the border quickly. He didn't do that. He left it open for about 100 days after the military briefed him of the risk. And when people suggested the border should close, he just called them racist. Finally, he agreed that they were right. So he then closed the borders too late. The second job was to procure rapid tests so that we'd be able to people would be able to quickly find out if they're positive or negative, and we could reopen a lot of different economic opportunities by simply testing people and removing people who are positive from their jobs for a couple of weeks while they recover and allowing everyone else to go on. He failed in that. We were one of the slowest countries to procure rapid tests. And then, of course, the third was the vaccines. As you know, Anthony, he put all of his faith in China. He spent the first 100 days of the crisis relying on a CanSino deal that never came to fruition. Surprise, surprise. It really is incredible that this was the most important purchase of the federal government since we bought arms to fight the Second World War. And the one country he chooses to rely upon for that purchase is the one that's holding our people hostage. You'd think that you could there'd be another country in the roughly 200 nations of the earth that he would turn to. But that key, the 100 days, put us at the back of the bus and left us trying to scramble and get deals with the mainstream European and American vaccine makers after everyone else had signed on. And that's why we're where we are today. This wave would not have happened if people had the option to get vaccinated in January and February when they were being vaccinated in the States and across Europe. So effectively, we're experiencing what I call the Trudeau wave right now, where we're all locked down once again because we couldn't get vaccines on time while others did. So those were his 3 main responsibilities, and in all of them he failed. and he asks us to give him grades because he's lent the population $350 billion. And I say lent because he's going to require they repay it on their taxes as interest accumulates on the debt. That he's lent us a bunch of our own money in order to get us through it. He believes he should be thanked for that. Well, he shouldn't have had to do that in the first place. We should have been able to protect our population and keep our economies largely open to avoid those costs.
Colonel Redman, how should we look at the issue of vaccines from an emergency management perspective? I understand that the procuring of them, the rolling out of them and so forth, the public assurances, that whole conversation, that's all a part of emergency management plans in the past as well, if I'm not mistaken.
It definitely is. And I don't want to be seen as an outlier in this discussion, but as far as I'm concerned, vaccines are a red herring. And the reason I'm going to say that is I'm an ex-soldier. I've been vaccinated up the yin yang for all the strange countries I've been to, for cholera, for yellow fever, for everything. And I'm a strong believer in vaccines. I've already had my first Pfizer. But the reason I call them a red herring is they're now being used as the club to say we can't reopen until everyone's vaccinated. That's absolutely wrong. It was wrong, and we should never have chased the vaccine trail from last March. Number one, you can't count on the fact that you'll get a vaccine this fast. Number two, I want to go back to what Dr. Strauss said about managing your own risk. If you're under the age of 60, the chances of a severe outcome from COVID are 50% less than being a traffic fatality. So you need to manage when you want the vaccine, how you're going to get the vaccine, and all the information you need to get about the vaccine. But the government shouldn't be using it as a club to stop us opening up our economy when we know we never should have closed our economy. It is a complete red herring to be using it now as the benchmark to reopen our economy when we know that people under 60 aren't at risk. And if we protect the people over 60 with severe comorbidities, many of which who are now vaccinated, but even if they weren't, if we provide targeted protection for them, the vaccine is nothing but a red herring. You can get it when you need it based on your requirements and what you believe the risk is to your body.
Okay, well, let's get into that question about, moving goalposts, because there's been a lot of frustrations. If we look back at arguments or discussions that were being had 3 months ago, 6 months ago, 9 months ago, it's interesting how things have changed in terms of when we should reopen, what's the main concern, case numbers, ICU rates, vaccination rates, and so forth. Professor Audas, you're joining us from New Zealand, of course, where the conversation's a little bit different, but I know you're tuned to what's going on here in Canada. I mean, what should the goalpost be right now? Is it something it should have been before? Where do we head to in terms of what are the key metrics that should matter most right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think that sort of vaccines are one tool in the toolkit, and I think they do reduce the risk of transmission. So I think that people need to feel safe and confident when they do go out and about. And I do agree that that people do need to assess and evaluate their own risks. And as Dr. Strauss points out, this is something that that we do every day. And Mr. Redman points this out as well. So I think these are really good points to make, that we do need to manage our risks. And one of the things that we want is tools to manage those risks. And I think vaccines are an important part of that toolkit. And even if you are at low risk, it certainly makes your risk that much lower. And I think one of the things, and again, as Dr. Strauss points out, that one of the things that we want to do is not just worry about you yourself getting the disease, but your ability to pass that disease on to somebody else. So it's a communicable disease, and I think that's something that these are important things to measure and keep in mind, that that we do need to be confident, and even if we did reduce the restrictions on people's activities, I think that people would still be fearful. So one thing I can say, and speaking from here in New Zealand, there is absolutely, there's almost zero fear of COVID-19. Nobody here wears a mask, except unless they get on public transportation or on an airplane. We go to large sporting events. We go to restaurants. There's no restrictions because people feel the risks are low.
Let me ask you though, Professor, I know that there was a recent mini lockdown in Auckland, and there was a major outrage that the playgrounds were shut in Ontario just last weekend for 24 hours. New Zealand Auckland shut down the playgrounds just last month as well. When new cases emerge, when we learn, a case is seeped out of a quarantine facility, does that create public fear, or is there public trust that it's being dealt with? Is there still fear of the virus broad-based?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think that there is still a fear, and I think that the fear isn't so much of the virus. The fear is that it's going to, and actually, this is where there's almost a kind of outrage if people sort of basically go against the rules, and if people are seen to be in violation of the rules. You know, we all see that as an affront to our liberties. That, you know, we're able to move freely and to do things because the disease is well managed and under control, and that's, you know, and that's been crucial to all of this. So I think
Right.
that there's sort of widespread acceptance that, you know, that there. This is a disease that has to be grappled with, and if we're strategic and we're quick, and I think those are the two things that we see here. That there's no sort of, and I think as you know, as we've heard, that, you know, slow responses have been deadly here, and when governments have responded slowly, people have unnecessarily died, and there has been you know, the response gets bigger and bigger. The disease is incredibly predictable,
Right.
I think, in a lot of ways, and if we move quickly and do things quickly, the impact can be far less and really concentrated on where the risk is greatest.
Dave, I see
Andrew, can I
something
challenge
there.
that for
Yeah,
a minute?
go ahead.
I want to bring up the example of Sweden, which the Western media has tried to destroy. Sweden did not follow the lockdowns, and the key word I want to keep coming back to is fear. We've used fear. Sweden used confidence. They believe in social distancing of 1 meter where possible. They have not closed their schools and done damage to their school children other than for 2 very short periods, only for their senior high schools. They believe that businesses should be remaining open and have not closed them. They also have ensured that people are allowed to still gather and still deal with each other, and masks are only recommended on rapid transit. It's 15 months now. 154 people total under the age of 60 have died of COVID in Sweden. Swedes do not have fear of coronavirus. They haven't been using targeted and untargeted, and they have gotten on with their lives. The fear generated by the Western media against Sweden somehow hasn't affected them, and COVID has not been the overarching thing in their lives for the last 15 months. In fact, their challenge was their seniors, and yes, the average age of death in Sweden is 87, and yes, they've lost a number of people, but their death per capita is lower than Great Britain, France, even Switzerland, Italy, Spain, all of which have used massive lockdowns. So if lockdowns are so effective, why is everyone in Sweden not dead? And why are Swedes not living in fear of COVID? That would be my point.
I want to get Pierre to, if I can get Pierre to jump in here on this, Pierre, because I know we're talking about metrics for reopenings, and you out of the gate said, look, the plan's got to be reopen the Canadian economy as soon as possible in a sort of maximal way. What do you think those metrics should be then in making those decisions?
Well, listen, I think now that we have secured the a plan to vaccinate the country, there is no excuse for long-term lockdowns. And I think that we should have a staged reopening. I don't know exactly what metric should trigger the opening of which sectors, because I frankly haven't been that involved in the provincial decision-making, which controls most of these things. But listen, I think we're the last excuse for these lockdowns has been people weren't vaccinated. We're told that that's going to change over the next 2 or 3 months. So as the rates of vaccination increase, then the opening should likewise increase. We should be managing towards limiting ICU. The only argument for lockdowns is that our ICUs will be overwhelmed. We're told that if we allowed people to spread the virus unabated, that there'll be this massive surge in people needing intensive care, and therefore the hospitals will overflow, and there won't be the ability to protect people and provide basic health care. If that doesn't happen, if that is not the serious risk any longer, because the population is vaccinated and because the people who are most likely to be hospitalized when they contract the disease are no longer likely to get it, then there really is no public rationale for prolonged removal of liberties. Rather, people should be able to make their own calculation of risk, as some of your panelists have said. So to me, that really has been the only justification all along, is the overwhelming of our hospital system. Besides, absent that problem, then the issue should really be a matter of personal decision, personal ability to make decisions about whether one is prepared to take a risk to participate in a certain activity. So that's sort of an overview of how I would approach the reopening.
Okay, speaking of hospital capacity, we have someone who is very familiar with that firsthand experience. So, Dr. Strauss, you said, yes, this is a very real situation that you're experiencing, and there's obviously people who you're caring for right now, and we wish them all well. We do hear from some medical professionals. They go on television, radio, they give a very emotional appeal that yes, we need these lockdowns. We need to keep doing this stuff aggressively because of that situation. ICUs facing a lot of capacity issues there. At the same time, some people ask, well, hold on a second, that doesn't seem to have really anything to do with whether or not a patio in Belleville should or should not be legally allowed to operate. What do you think about the metric of ICU capacity or hospitalization rates as a determinant for broader liberties?
Right. So the idea that we need to lock down so that we protect our ICUs presumes that lockdowns protect ICUs. I have not seen any high quality peer reviewed data to show that that is the case. It is in fact the Toronto and Peel region ICUs that are overwhelmed right now, and they have been locked down longer than any other city in North America. So if it was the case that lockdowns worked and they could protect ICUs, then we could have a conversation about locking down until the ICUs are protected. But that does not appear to be the case. Secondly, I would say, if it were the case that lockdowns could protect ICUs and our ICUs are over capacity, that is not an excuse for the fact that ICUs are over capacity. We're 14 months into this. We all saw China building new hospitals in 2 weeks. Our total ICU capacity, and I get these numbers from Critical Care Services Ontario every week, has not gone up appreciably over this whole year.
And but now what your colleagues say is staffing is the issue. They don't have nurses who can staff level 3 ICU beds, and therefore that is the justification. So what do you say to that sort of more advanced response they give?
Yeah, so I'm good at my job. I know about my job, and I happen word of mouth to know a lot about physician staffing. There are the average ICU physician in Ontario is actually underemployed. It takes about 8 months to train a nurse to be a critical care nurse. 8 months is less than 14 months. Like, there's just been such a failure of imagination on the level of the provincial government to build capacity. And we were starting with half as many ICU beds per capita as places like Germany and the United States. Hospitals have been full every year that I've been a physician, and I started medical school in 2004. And I've posted Toronto Star articles saying that like half of the hospitals in Ontario were overwhelmed in 2017 with the flu virus. So COVID is real. I don't see any clear evidence that lockdowns will protect ICUs, and we cannot reward the healthcare mismanagers who have left our ICU and hospital system to be bedraggled the way it is. We can't reward their incompetence with power to suspend our human rights whenever they've been extra incompetent.
Okay. Pierre, I know you've got some legislative duties to attend to at the top of the hour. We're going to keep the conversation going a little bit beyond then, but I wanted to get your thoughts while we still have you on that sort of healthcare funding management perspective. I know it's a provincial issue, the day-to-day management, but a lot of people say, well, what makes Canada great is this access to universal healthcare and so forth. That's what gets us compared to the US a lot. And health transfers is an issue that you and your colleagues on the Hill talk about a lot. What's going on with the healthcare question, the healthcare conversation? How can it be that our country's been brought to its knees or shut down in perpetuity or what have you because of these sort of administrative issues that Dr. Strauss brings up?
Well, it's once again more of the same in Canada, that nothing can get done because of the bureaucratic resistance to action. As Dr. Strauss points out, other countries turned on a dime to expand their ICU capacity. I didn't know that China was building hospitals in 2 weeks, but here in Ottawa, we're talking about building a hospital that's going to probably take 10 years by the time it gets done. It doesn't make sense. Like around the world, large scale facilities are built in months, not years. And here in Canada, we can't do that, even though we were told from the very beginning that the reason we had to be locked down last spring was because of ICU capacity. You'd think there would have been a monstrous buildup of ICU capacity in the period that we were locked down. There wasn't. And here we are again told that we have exactly the same problem. I don't think it's just an issue of money either. The healthcare budgets in Canada have been growing. During the Harper years, they grew at 6% a year. That's about 4.5 times the rate of inflation. Even if you throw in population growth, the healthcare budget for the federal government was growing about 2.5 times the combined population growth and inflation. And provinces have similarly increased budgets, but more money is not getting us better results. And Jim Balsillie said at the industry committee, I think he was speaking generally, we have first world budgets with third world results. And he wasn't speaking about healthcare, he's just speaking generally about how this country operates in every sector. So in the United States, for example, they accelerated the recognition of credentials for immigrant doctors and other physicians from out of state. So I think it was Massachusetts that said, if you're licensed to practice in other states, we will allow you to practice here during COVID in order to up our healthcare providers. And guess what? Nothing, it didn't do any harm. There wasn't a reduction in the ability of these people to do service. So you wonder how many immigrant doctors we have in Canada who are waiting and waiting and waiting to get licensed, even though they've practiced medicine in similarly advanced countries with perfect records. And they can't practice either medicine or nursing in our facilities because of slow occupational licensing rules. These are the sorts of things you would think we would snap into action when this crisis hit back in 2020 and say, we're going to turn this around. But no, our bureaucratic systems, our gatekeepers are so entrenched that they won't let anything change because they worry it might impinge upon their own privileges.
Professor Audas, can I get your perspective there from the international vantage point? Because Canada, liking to brag about its medical system a lot, but then we find ourselves, compared to other countries that don't have the same system, they seem to be faring better, at least compared to your misery index there. Looking at all of these metrics here, how can this be? It almost seems like the sort of myth making of the Canadian healthcare system is in some sense, not as accurate as people would like it to be.
It's not at all. In fact, you're quite right. So most, international comparisons of healthcare, when we look at, at a broad range of health outcomes, Canada does worse than most other developed countries. We happen to typically do better than the U.S., and that seems to be enough to make us feel like our healthcare system is doing just fine, and it's not. We have a system that is bureaucratically slow. As has been pointed out, it doesn't deliver very well in terms of value for money. It reacts, say very slowly to crises, and I think the pandemic has shone a light on all of those challenges. So and I think the answer isn't spending more money. More money is not going to be the solution to curing the healthcare woes. I think it is coming up with a more responsive, a more nimble system that works well and deals with the crises that are put in front of them and has the resources to do so. And so, no, I think that that it's a point that I make routinely in my classes. I teach on the Canadian healthcare system and do a lot of international comparisons, and I think it's one of the things that's often shocking to students, because we sort of like to think that we've got one of the best healthcare systems in the world, and we compare with other developed countries. We're not even close. And certainly our work that we've done in the misery index points to largely the same things, and it's a large degree, it's a false comparison, that in some respects we are better than the US, in some respects they're better than us. And certainly, one of the things that we've seen in the US is certainly their agility, I think, to move forward through this. Is I think obviously things started out badly at the beginning, but certainly in recent months they certainly are doing much better than we are, and I think that that hinges on their sort of ability to be nimble and to move to resources and get results.
Okay, I want to go back to what Dave Redman was saying at the very beginning about fear and about the way we talk about coronavirus. I know there's a lot of frustrations about sort of general broader communications channels, the information that is or isn't getting out there, media coverage and so forth. Diane McMurray writes in, do you have any idea as to why medical professionals who oppose lockdowns receive little or no attention? example, the Great Barrington Declaration and other individual medical epidemiologists, they seem to be silenced. And the co-authors of Barrington Declaration are from the top institutes in the world and very credentialed individuals. First, I definitely want Matt's perspective from the medical side. Dave, what do you think about this sort of this boxing in of perspective?
Okay, I definitely want to speak to that, but I just want to give one last piece of perspective to the discussion we just had about hospital capacity.
Sure.
Back in the middle of the second wave, at its worst, we heard Premier Ford saying that there was 1,760 acute care beds occupied by COVID patients and the hospital system was overwhelmed. What's been missing all the way through this discussion is denominators. I'm going to actually pick up the fact sheet. Do you know that there are 22,358 acute care beds in Ontario, not counting mental health, not counting specialist health in any way, regular acute care beds. So when we're told 2,000 beds are filled by COVID patients, if the hospitals are overwhelmed when there's 22,358 beds, we're intentionally not told the denominator to lead to exactly what the segue to your second question. We know for a fact that people who speak a different narrative are not allowed on mainstream media. And we also have seen it happen in independent media. The reason why people like Danielle Smith left independent media was because she was censored. I and another individual have done a documentary which cannot get to air because we are talking against mainstream media's position. If we can't get to mainstream media, and that is the intention of the special advisory boards that are in support of our MOH, is that they get the media time for the mainstream media, that keeps the fear campaign going to support the medical system. Supporting a medical system that is challenged every year, as we've heard, that has done nothing for surge capacity. And let's talk about surge capacity for just a second. Surge capacity is people, infrastructure, equipment, and supplies. Emergency management builds those four things for every type of hazard before it happens and as it's happening. We should have built all four of those. We've heard about the ways that we can increase personnel, some of them, advanced accreditation for people that are waiting for accreditation from other areas, advancing training in specific areas, recalling people who've recently retired. There's a whole series of ways. Instead, we haven't heard that happening, and we've just constantly been told we're going to overwhelm our systems. It's not acceptable, and it's a campaign of fear intentionally to protect one system, the hospital system, but at the expense of our seniors, at the expense of our schooling, at the expense of our mental health, our societal health. We've seen the increases in spousal abuse. We've seen children's abuse. There's a huge article in the paper today. Right. All the rest of the collateral damage has been ignored by mainstream media to focus on protection of the hospital system. It leaves me baffled why mainstream media won't allow, other than you, Anthony, literally you, into mainstream media, an alternative narrative.
All right, we've just got about 10 minutes left. Before we get into some closing statements that I'd ask you all to make, Dr. Strauss, can I get your response to what Colonel Redman was saying?
Yeah, so there clearly has been a chill factor. As a physician, folks have complained about what I say, and I think everything I've said is quite reasonable. And I was a very mainstream physician until the world went a little bit insane. Folks have complained about me to my hospital. They've complained about me to my university, and most folks are not interested in dealing with that sort of pressure. I like to say I've walked through fire and I haven't got burned. Everything I say is backed up by peer-reviewed scientific literature. So no harm truly has come to me. Other physicians have been put under pressure, like have had college complaints, this sort of thing. So there definitely is a fear factor that people are fanning the flames of intentionally. When I first wrote one of my articles for The Spectator, a former classmate of mine emailed me to say, if you keep talking like this, people won't be scared. And if they're not scared, they won't take our advice. And I thought that is completely backwards and such a negative attitude in terms of medicine and medical advice. I think the thing to do going forward is for folks to be bold. I think no one can come after you for talking about consent and human rights. And if they do, they're only making fools of themselves. So then that's how we're gonna fight this narrative of fear, by all speaking up together.
All right, and speaking of that, speaking up together, that's a theme in a lot of the questions I've heard from people in recent months saying they write nonstop emails to elected officials. They try to do everything they can. Participant Carola writes in with a question: what can Canadians do in their communities if they want to affect change? Pierre, how would you answer that?
Yes, speak up. Don't be silenced. There is, as Dr. Strauss correctly.
Oh, you're on mute now, Pierre.
There is, we've all heard about herd immunity. Well, there's an attempt to drive herd consensus and to prevent anyone who has a contrary point of view from stating it out loud. Those who are confident in the factual underpinnings of their position should not fear debate. They should welcome it. And the people in the community should speak up when they hear things that don't make any sense to them. They should not be afraid. And they should say so in the public, on their social media, and across every network they can, so that we have a good debate and thrash these issues out based on facts, not based on a manufactured consensus that silences anyone who disagrees and puts on a pedestal those in authority who have consistently stated what everyone now agrees to be false information.
Yeah, Professor Audas, I know you're in a line of work where I'm sure for many years now you've been attending conferences where people, politely say, I disagree in response to a thesis proposition or what have you. That's just how academia works. That's how public health academia should presumably work. But a lot of complaints from professionals that is not what is happening right now.
No, I think that certainly open discourse is crucial, and I think certainly the evidence on COVID-19 is evolving. We learn more, and I think as we learn more, that should allow us to be more targeted in what we do. So I do think that we still are using the blunt instruments of 15 months ago, when in an absence of information, perhaps the safest thing might have been to do is say, right, let's lock down. I think now that we have more information, we can assess the risks and use that risk to make better judgments and to make better and more nuanced, more subtle adjustments to protect those who are truly at risk and truly at the highest levels of risk, but then to allow the rest of us to function more or less normally.
Dr. Strauss, what should people do if they want to affect change?
I need your support. It means a lot emotionally. I will say when the second lockdown was announced in the winter, that was really dark, and I was having to go to a lot of meetings about my public commentary. So I just need you to keep speaking out. And I've like I said, I've walked through fire, haven't got burned. So I think you can as well. I think talk to your neighbors about it and focus on these issues of personal risk, human rights, and consent. And I think they're undeniable. There's no argument to be had on them.
And yet, Dave Redman, for everybody who shares all the perspectives that have been voiced today in this great conversation, there's just as many other people who I think believe, oh no, we need an even harder lockdown in Canada right now. I don't even understand what that would be and how that would be constituted. But there's certainly a split of opinion out there among neighbors, among even within families. How do we tackle this? I mean, there's a lot of, I'm very afraid that the social fabric has been torn in this nation. How do we proceed on that front?
Okay, so 2 points. Number one, fear. Fear is a very powerful tool and should never have been used. It's never to be used in an emergency. I'll give you one short anecdote. I was a colonel in the middle of a war zone with a battalion. If every morning I walked out in front of my troops and said, I think we're going to be overwhelmed, I don't think we can handle the enemy, I really think they're going to kill us all today, or I walked out of my hut every morning, looked at the troops and said, we got this, let's go. What do you think the two reactions are from my soldiers? That's exactly what's happened to the Canadian public. And since March last year, they've heard nothing but our hospital systems are going to fail, you're all going to die. We need to change that narrative of fear. To change that narrative of fear, those who believe what we're saying need equal time to give perspective in mainstream media. We also need all our citizens to call their MLA, their MPP, and to do it every day and the Premier's office. COVID, the response to a pandemic is a provincial responsibility. They run the healthcare system. So until the premiers remove the lockdown mentality, it's going to stay in every province and territory in Canada. So we need you, the public, and all the people that think like you to call your MLAs, MPPs, and your premiers every single day and tell them what they're doing is wrong and get the facts and science. You can get it at pandemicalternative.org. You can get it from Dr. Strauss. You can get it from a whole bunch of people, but force it. Writing letters doesn't work, folks. I've been doing it for 14 months. You have to phone, and you have to overwhelm their phone systems. We have to remove the narrative of fear with no perspective.
All right, there we have it. What a powerful conversation with some great heavy hitters, Professor Audas, Dr. Strauss, Colonel Redman, and Pierre Poilievre. Troy Lanigan, over to you, sir, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to moderate this great conversation.
Well, thank you, Anthony, and to all the panels for an excellent discussion. Someone wrote to Dr. Redman about calling MPPs. They said, my MPP is Kathleen Wynne. What's my chances of success? We'll let that one stand. Hey, again, this exchange call will be posted on our website and on our YouTube page inside the next 2 hours. In addition, we'll be sending to everyone on this call today a summary of resources sheet from the organization David Redman is involved with, pandemicalternative.org. And thank you to Ron Kurtz for helping put that together. You can find Dr. Audas's COVID Misery Index at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Let's also support our professionals like Dr. Strauss, who has the courage to speak out in this era of groupthink. I commend you, sir, so much. I think what you're doing is extremely brave. And of course, Anthony Furey's writing at Sun Newspapers and on True North News. I want to thank again our partner organization, Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers and Businesses of Canada, and especially our sponsor today, Modern Miracle Network. We'll be back next month, May 18th, when we tackle the topic Beyond the Carbon Tax. We are the Canada Strong and Free Network. And if you appreciate and value the work we're doing, please consider a donation. Thank you, everyone, for joining today, and we'll see you again soon. Bye for now.